Hello, Joe from Camera Lessons Online here, and today we are going to be talking about the concept of exposing to the left. What does that mean? How do you actually do it, both when you're shooting, and then how do you maximize that shooting technique for when you are editing? We're in a little bit of a couple videos that I want to do regarding things that you can build into your editing practice to make your end results even better. So before we jump into that, everything we do here is of course brought to you by Camera Lessons Online. Here's the website. We've got of course a lot of free downloads, including an introduction to photography download that's on there. 8-page brochure. We have several books on macro photography and travel photography, and here's our third book, 7 photos to make you a better photographer, which is 7 challenges that just by doing them will force you to grow your photographic skills. And then of course we've got a 4-hour introduction to photography online class that you can check out. So lots of stuff there. But today we're talking about a concept called exposing to the left. You may have heard of this. Not enough people have. This is, I would call it an intermediate exposing technique. And we call it that because when we're first learning exposure, aperture, shutter speed, ISO, we are just trying to be able to move those pieces around until we build something that looks like a photograph and can do it consistently. And that's a good skill. But what happens when you are in especially a contrasty environment? And by contrasty, take a look at this image here. Bright sun right in the frame, deep, deep shadows spread throughout the frame. So here we've got something with a lot of very bright highlights, very dark shadows. So this is very contrasty. Well, how do you maximize the information that you are recording and the end result that you create when you have an image like this? And the technique is called exposing to the left. So we're going to talk about what it is and why you do it and how you maximize it. And I want to start with the basic premise. And the premise is this. A lot of people, when they get into photography, they believe that when they shoot the picture, the goal at that moment is to, as close as possible, create their end result, their end piece of art in the camera. This is not true. Some other people make a very different mistake, and they believe that photo editing is there as a crutch to fix mistakes in shooting, and that is not true either. Instead, think of your process from shooting to a final image as one piece of artistic endeavor. Shooting is the point when you grab as much information as you possibly can, and then your editing is where you refine that until you have the finished result that you envisioned. And they really do go hand in glove. In order to be very good at manual exposure, you really only need to understand aperture, shutter, and ISO, and you need to be able to read a histogram. And this is one right here. So this is where we're paying attention. If you don't know how to read a histogram, we are going to get into it right now. So a histogram is this chart which is mapping out the pixels in the frame by brightness. So if I hover over any place, it tells me how bright that pixel is with that orange line. And so I know at any point, is this a bright area or a dark area? Okay. Now, darker areas are on the left and brighter areas are on the right. So here we've got a big bunch of shadows, and that's right inside of here and here and here. And then we've got, it trails off, and we've got pixels throughout the frame at middle values, and then we get this area right here that's a spike, and of course that is the sun right there. And so when you are looking at your histogram, it can inform you about how accurately you have exposed the shot. And this is why I advise, if your camera can shoot with the histogram turned on, you should do so, because it gives you a lot of very useful information to make sure that you are exposing properly. Now, if you cannot, with your particular camera, shoot with the histogram turned on, then at least you should be reviewing images with the histogram turned on, which all cameras can do. And when you're in a light contrasty environment, a question will come up, and that is, do I expose this properly? In other words, do I take my subject matter and do I expose it to be a midtone? And in an environment like this, the answer is no, we don't want to do that. So if I actually made my areas of my fence here and some of this brush and trees, if I expose that properly, it would brighten the image and I would have blown out the sky. I would have lost all this nice rich blue color. I would have shifted my histogram to the right, which is a brighter exposure, but I would have clipped that information. Now, if you haven't heard that term before, clipping is when a pixel touches the underexposed or overexposed wall, and that means they turn into pure black or white pixels respectively. Now, when that happens, we have a situation where you have a pure white or pure black pixel and there's no information. You can't pull back information in post. You can lighten a black pixel or you can darken a white one and they'll turn gray, but you won't pull information out. And so the goal of proper exposure is first and foremost to clip as few pixels as you possibly can. And second is then to get the exposure to something that is about what you inevitably or eventually want. Now, here's where an interesting quirk of sensors comes into play. Digital sensors record more information on the underexposed side of midtone than overexposed. In other words, they do not clip at a symmetrical rate from center, from 18% gray. You will get more information in your shadowed area. You will lose highlights. So this technique of exposing to the left, which is shooting until your histogram is moved as far left as possible before you clip your shadows, is also known as protecting highlights. So how do you do this when you're shooting? You take a look, and if you have clipped highlights, you darken your exposure until one of two things happens. First, you are no longer clipping highlights. Second, if that doesn't happen, which was not possible here, then you move as dark as possible until you would clip shadows and you stop. So one of those two things is going to happen, and that's how you will maximize the amount of information that you actually record. And that's going to give you the ability to get the best end result. So if we had exposed this properly, realistically, I think this is a proper shooting exposure, but if we had tried to shoot it so that our subject was midtone, we would have blown out the sky. So now let's see what we can do with that. Of course, we shot the image in RAW, and we have information everywhere in the frame except for some parts of the sun. So we know we're not going to pull that back. But let's see what we can do. First, we're going to take our shadows and we're going to brighten them. And because shadows hold a lot of information, I was able to pull back just a ton of data. Now I'm going to take highlights and I'm going to darken them. And I can't pull back the very middle of the sun. I knew that going in. But I already here have an exposure that I'm happy with. So this is the end result that I had in mind while shooting. But in order to achieve it, I could not shoot it this way. Now, just the way that I would edit this particular image is I would take my color temperature and I would warm it by just a little bit because I want that sun to really feel like it's warming all of this area here, and I'm done. I've got an image that I'm happy with. And just for reference sake there, before and after. You'll see it move. That's because I also edited for horizon line before we got started. So that's exposing to the left, pushing your exposure, making it darker until one of two things happens. The first is no longer clipping a highlight, or getting it so that you are just about to clip your shadows and knowing that you can correct your image in post-production. Hopefully this was helpful and useful in your shooting and in creating great visual art. Thank you so much for joining me, and I'll see you next time.